Prologue. The year was 2022. The world was yet to know of the cataclysm that would soon befall it, originating from the most unlikely of places, a nondescript research lab, nestled amongst the rugged backdrop of Colorado. This lab, funded by a government that turned a blind eye to its operations, was a place where the rulebook for scientific ethics was considered null and void, a place where regulations were a mere footnote. The scientists toiled, their minds ablaze with visions of a cure-all, a serum to end all disease. They were pioneers on the frontier of medical science, or at least, that's the narrative they spun. The government, seduced by the promise of a universal antidote, gave them leave to function outside the boundaries of what was deemed right and proper. As the world around them descended into chaos, a wave of novel illnesses wreaking havoc upon human health, the demand for a miracle cure grew. The government mandate was clear: everyone was to receive this serum, this antidote, this cure-all. Resistance was minimal, as the world watched, paralyzed, as death and sickness swept across the lands. There was no great debate, no polarizing political campaign. Only silence, punctuated by the desperate hope for salvation. The serum was administered, first in Colorado, then across the United States, and eventually, the world. But the miracle cure, this beacon of hope, was nothing more than a false prophet. The serum brought not salvation, but annihilation. It was the harbinger of a deadly disease, a contagion with a 99.2% kill rate. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. In the span of 3 months, the world's population was decimated. 6.8 billion lives extinguished, snuffed out by the very thing that was meant to save them. Towns fell silent, cities became ghost towns, nations were empty shells of their former selves. The world, once vibrant and bustling, was now a desolate wasteland. The scattered few who survived walked the planet's lonely surface, the echoes of the lost reverberating through the silence. They were the remnants of a world that was, a testament to the hubris of humanity. A year after the apocalypse, the world is silent save but a few. And thus, our story begins. Beckett had been 12 when the world had crumbled around him, when a dark veil of illness had swept across the globe, leaving in its wake a chilling silence. By the time he turned 13, he found himself the lone survivor in the once bustling suburbs of Detroit. The boy who had once laughed and played in these streets was now a figure hardened by the harsh realities of survival in a post-apocalyptic world. His clothes were nothing more than tattered rags clinging to his thin frame. They were a patchwork quilt of fabrics, each piece carrying the memory of times and places long past. The sleeves of his shirt, frayed at the edges, bore the remnants of his mother's loving stitches. His pants, worn and faded, were a testament to countless days spent scavenging through the ruins of his town. His boots, mismatched and worn, had been scavenged from the remnants of a forgotten shoe store. Beckett's knees were scraped and raw, his fingers were scuffed, the skin hardened from countless tasks of daily survival. Dirt was lodged firmly between his knuckles, a permanent reminder of the earth he now called home. But despite the harshness of his existence, there was a certain diligence in his stride, a determination that matched every step he took on the cracked pavement. On this particular day, Beckett found himself trailing a bleeding deer through the streets of Westland. The animal had been hit by a forgotten trap he had set days ago. It was wounded, but not fatally, and it was Beckett's only hope for a decent meal. His eyes were sharp, scanning the abandoned cityscape as he pursued his prey. The deer's blood left a stark trail against the gray concrete, leading him through a labyrinth of abandoned cars. Each vehicle was a relic of a world that once was, a monument frozen in a grim visage. Beckett maneuvered through the maze with an eerie familiarity, weaving between rusted sedans and overturned buses. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail, each drop of blood a beacon guiding him towards his meal. The city streets, once filled with the hum of life, were now his hunting ground. Every so often, he would pause, placing a scuffed finger to the ground to confirm the direction of the trail. His blue eyes, hardened by the harsh reality of his life, this was not just a hunt for food, it was his life for the next few weeks if successful. Beckett pauses at the blood spot, pressing his calloused fingers gently to the crimson stain. It's fresh, still damp and slightly tacky against his skin. A sense of savage ancestry swells within him. Ahead, just beyond a Mitsubishi Eclipse, he saw the cotton-ball tail of the buck. Beckett crouched low, his breath steady, as he watched the deer bound away through the remnants of a once bustling city. Its hooves clattered against the broken asphalt, echoing through the empty streets that were now overgrown with weeds and sorrowful silence. He had spent days setting up the trap, meticulously crafting it with scraps salvaged from abandoned buildings and forgotten tools. Hunger gnawed at his belly, a constant reminder of the scarcity that plagued this shattered society. But now, his patience and efforts had paid off. The deer had wandered into his snare, only to break free at the last moment. With bow in hand and quiver filled with arrows, Beckett embarked on the pursuit. His senses sharpened as he entered the maze of ruined cars that had once been the city's heart. The skeletal remains of businesses loomed overhead like stone gargoyles, their broken windows reflecting the fading light of the dying day. He moved with grace, each step carefully calculated to avoid the shattered glass and twisted metal strewn across the pavement. Nature had begun reclaiming what was once mankind's domain, and Beckett found himself navigating a world where the boundaries of civilization and wilderness had blurred. The deer was a fleeting shadow, its graceful form a lighthouse to the desolation that surrounded them. Beckett's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance, his eyes never leaving his quarry. He knew that this chase was not just about satisfying his hunger, it was a testament to his survival, a reminder that amidst the ruins, he was still alive. The wind rustled through the broken windows, carrying with it the scent of decay and forgotten life. Beckett followed the trail of the deer through the twisted wreckage, his senses attuned to the slightest movement, the faintest sound. He had become a predator in this new world, adapting to its harsh realities. Finally, he caught sight of the deer, its silhouette framed against the backdrop of a crumbling building. He drew an arrow from his quiver, the tension of the bowstring filling the air. Time seemed to slow as he took aim, his muscles taut with anticipation. With a fluid motion, Beckett released the arrow, and it sailed through the night air, finding its mark. The deer staggered, a startled cry escaping its lips. It stumbled, its legs faltering under the weight of the wound. Beckett closed the distance between them, his heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. He had taken a life to preserve his own, a somber reality of this new world. Kneeling beside the fallen deer, Beckett offered a silent prayer of appreciation for the sacrifice it had made. With practiced hands, he began the process of dressing the animal, knowing that it would provide sustenance for days to come. In this desolate landscape, where hope had become a fragile ember, each successful hunt was a triumph over the relentless march of despair. As he shouldered the spoils of his chase, Beckett cast a final glance at the city's ruins, the remnants of a civilization that had crumbled under its own weight. Though only 13 years old, he had grown accustomed to finding sustenance on his own, and fending for himself became second nature. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the ruined city, he was eager to return to his camp for the night. When he arrived at the old building, he shouldered open the remains of a door and carried his prize inside. Kicking debris from the previous night's fire, Beckett laid the meat down near the collapsed ceiling, where fading daylight still shone through. After starting the small fire, Beckett selected several choice cuts of venison to cook for his dinner. He had hunted deer many times, and knew which parts were the most flavorful. As the meat sizzled over the flames, its tempting aroma filled the shelter. Once the steaks were done, Beckett eagerly devoured them. After months of scavenging for whatever edible plants and grains he could find, this hot meal of protein-rich meat was a true treat. He savored every bite as the warmth spread through his body. With his hunger fully sated, Beckett leaned back on his cot with a contented sigh. Smoke from the dwindling fire drifted up through the damaged ceiling above. Beckett watched the swirling gray tendrils fade into darkness and listened to the crackling embers. Safe within these sheltering walls, exhaustion from his long hunt began to overtake him. The events of the day replayed in his mind as sleep crept over his weary body. When morning light penetrated the shelter, Beckett awoke restored and eager for the new day. After a breakfast of venison sausages cooked over the rekindled fire, he packed several links away for future meals. The boy then set about preparing for a supply run. His larder was restocked thanks to the deer, but other necessities needed replenishing. Buckling on his backpack, Beckett ventured out once more into the post-apocalyptic world, ready to scavenge whatever resources he could find. 2. Beckett pushed his rusty shopping cart down a street he hadn't previously traveled. Most of the nearby blocks had been picked clean long ago, but hope remained that this direction held undiscovered resources. After a few miles, a partly collapsed building came into view with familiar red and white lettering, a pharmacy. Beckett heaved a loose brick through one of the few remaining windows. Clambering inside, he was amazed by what remained after a year of neglect. Shelves still held various pill bottles and boxes, though their contents were indistinguishable. Not wanting to waste this opportunity, Beckett grabbed as much as he could carry, stuffing his cart and pockets full of anything that seemed potentially useful. He then carefully made his way back outside, treasure secured. Pushing onward down the crumbling road, another structure emerged in the distance, a police cruiser, abandoned but otherwise intact. Beckett approached cautiously, mindful of past discoveries that were less than harmless. But within, something caught his eye mounted above, a shotgun, still in place after all this time. Beckett had to contain his excitement. In this harsh world, a reliable firearm could mean the difference between life and death. He had struck gold, finding on this expedition what may prove his most valuable prize yet. The boy couldn't wait to get back to inspect his new arsenal up close. With fresh motivation, he would need to explore this promising territory much further. As Beckett pushed his cart laden with supplies down the gloomy streets, his thoughts drifted to happier times long past. He remembered summer days playing tag with friends in the neighborhood park, their carefree laughter flowing without a care. Beckett thought of birthday parties and opening presents around the tree each Christmas morning. A warm glow filled his chest at the recollection of his family all together, Mom baking cookies, Dad reading stories by the fire. He particularly liked it when he read the ghost stories. But one detail refused to come fully into focus no matter how hard Beckett tried. The face of his little sister, lost in the chaos of those first terrible days, remained frustratingly vague. He could visualize her smile and the sparkle in her eyes, but her exact features were blurred as if seen through a fogged window. This inability to picture her face clearly filled Beckett with longing and sadness. A kid his age shouldn't even know what depression is, but for him it was a constant companion. His sister represented the innocent life that had been ripped away, leaving him to survive in this new brutal world alone. A lone tear tracked down his cheek as he pushed on, tracing a clean line down his dirty cheek. Back within sheltering walls once more, Beckett began inventorying his haul, wiping tears away. He began spreading out his bounty of pill bottles, reading each label carefully. Over the past year, he had scoured the remains of the local library for any medical references he could find. Hours spent poring over heavy textbooks had helped him learn to decipher various drug names and effects. Now, Beckett got to work putting that hard-earned knowledge to use. He sorted the bottles into piles, useful, and not sure, while double-checking information against his well-worn dictionaries. Medications like antibiotics and painkillers went into the first pile, things he may be able to actually identify a purpose for. Others' questioning remained uncertain but might still prove valuable someday. Throughout the process, Beckett made notes directly on the bottles using strips of tape and a permanent marker. Instead of unfamiliar chemical names, he listed known conditions each might help treat. This would allow for safe identification and use going forward, crucial in his isolated situation. By the end of the evening, Beckett had a carefully organized stockpile of potential remedies from the random haul. He smiled with satisfaction at the fruits of his meticulous work, so different from bright-labeled products from before. As the evening wore on, Beckett retrieved a plastic-wrapped parcel he kept stored under his desk. Inside were his most prized possessions, notebooks and writing implements scavenged in his earliest scavenging trips, before true survival had set in. Among the items was a large sheet of paper on which Beckett had meticulously hand-drawn a map of the local area. Roads, parks, landmarks, he noted everything he could remember or discover on his explorations. It served as a record of progress as well as a guide. Tonight, Beckett busied himself adding the new territory covered that day. Calculations in the margins helped avoid returning to areas already picked over. His fingers traced the lines as memories resurfaced of a mother pointing to a map of similar proportions, excitedly telling a young Beckett of the military base up north. Even in the earliest days after the fall, that base had captivated Beckett's imagination. Soldiers with real guns and supplies, defending civilians, it was like something out of a storybook. As the struggle wore on, finding that base became Beckett's ultimate goal, his sliver of hope in the post-apocalyptic wasteland. With the new additions made, Beckett rolled up the map carefully. As dawn's light began to filter into the shelter, Beckett woke suddenly to a clanging sound below. With learned reflexes, he nimbly climbed up onto a slanted beam to reach the damaged roof. Peering over the edge, he spied an unwelcome visitor nosing around below, a large bear, rooting through debris in search of food. Beckett's heart raced with instinctual fear at the predator's presence so near to his camp. But he took a slow, deep breath to quell his panic, remembering the strategies that had kept him safe this long. Remain still and quiet, do not threaten or startle. Let the animal find what it seeks without interfering in its hunt. Then it would return peacefully to the wilderness. So he hoped. So Beckett laid patiently upon his perch, watching with caution but also fascination as the bear sniffed and pawed among the rubble. It seemed only curious or hungry, posing no immediate danger if left undisturbed. 3. Morning sunlight roused Beckett from his unexpected slumber on the rooftop perch. Blinking away grogginess, he cursed internally, he must have dozed off while keeping watch for the bear's departure. Peering over the edge, there were no signs of the beast below. Sloppy, he chided himself. Falling asleep on lookout was unacceptable carelessness that could prove fatal in this harsh environment. He was lucky the small amount of food hadn't been enough to keep the bear lingering. But now its keen nose undoubtedly caught wind of his campsite location and scent. As Beckett stretched out tight muscles, he pondered this new wrinkle in his situation. With each hunt bringing fresh meat stores, the bear may return expecting an easy meal. But he had built this shelter precisely to avoid roaming predators. He couldn't fend off a full-grown male if it decided to claim his meager supplies as its own. Relocating would require tremendous effort after months of establishing this haven. But where there was a will, there was a way. And Beckett was nothing if not resilient. With a sigh, he accepted the hard task ahead. It was time to fortify defenses at a new safe point and begin preparations for migrating his home base once more. Change was the one constant in this world. Squinting down at his worn map, Beckett studied the landscape for potential new shelter sites. To the west lay unmarked terra incognita, but the terrain grew hillier, which could provide strategic vantage. Rolling up the parchment, he set about methodically gathering his most critical stored provisions. Into the cart went dried meats and grains, bottles of water, medical supplies and his most valued possession, the shotgun. Thus outfitted, Beckett pushed off down the pavement under a punishing midday sun. He covered the 2 hours swiftly, determination propelling tired legs past familiar scavenged zones. As the shadow of his cart grew longer, Beckett knew he had well surpassed previous explorations. Unknown buildings now flanked the cracked roadway. Sweat soaked through his clothes from the demanding labor, but he paused only to refill his canteen before pressing onward. The sun showed no mercy upon this barren terrain. But Beckett possessed an inner fire too, a will to thrive that had sustained him when others would have fallen. As he forged into the hazy horizon, hopes were high that this new western frontier held the key to stronger defenses against the approaching threats of nature. Beckett paused to catch his breath after hours of traversing the lonely landscape. Shielding his eyes, he scanned the barren terrain for any signs of potential shelter. A glint in the distance caught his keen sight, something metallic reflecting in the harsh sun. Cautiously leaving his cart, shotgun in hand, Beckett crept towards the object of intrigue. As he drew near, a wide grin broke across his dusty face. Lying intact among the rubble was a mountain bike. He could scarcely believe his luck at this serendipitous find. A bicycle would vastly transform his mobility and scouting abilities. No longer restricted to exhausted locomotion, new territories could be accessed with greater ease and haste. Beckett knew in an instant his destination plans had changed. Rather than burrowing into the outskirts as originally intended, the bike would allow passage safely deeper into the urban ruins. There he hoped to find structures more suited for long-term inhabitation. Renewed spirit surged through Beckett's tired frame at this opportunity's potential. Wasting no time, he began preparing the bike for transport back to his cart. Quicker transportation coupled with the shelter of concrete canyons, this drastic change in fortunes may just prove the pivotal advantage Beckett needed to thrive. With perseverance, Beckett was able to fashion a secure mount linking his cart to the back of the new bicycle. The accumulated provisions weighed heavily, but he steeled himself for the strenuous journey ahead. Pedaling west through the quiet suburbs, Beckett took note of the undisturbed homes around him. It seemed this area avoided the panicked exodus that abandoned other zones. Perhaps the inhabitants here had made the logical choice to shelter in place from the outbreak. The clear roads allowed Beckett steady progress towards his destination of Detroit. Along the way, glimpses through windows showed orderly lives suddenly frozen. Family portraits still hung, though their subjects had long since turned to dust. By evening, urban sprawl took shape on the horizon. Beckett pulled over to rest weary legs and enjoy the last pink glow at the sky's edge. With a full stomach and the security of his weapon, a blanket of stars soon welcomed sleep. Dawn would bring entrance to a new environment, the challenge of scavenging amid Detroit's concrete jungle. 4. As the sunset painted Detroit in hues of orange, Beckett began scouting for suitable shelter. He wanted protection before exploring the unknown city beneath veils of night. An intact-looking house soon caught his eye. Peering within confirmed his hopes, doors and windows still securely fastened after years of silence. But one pane had come free, allowing Beckett entry without damage. Inside brought further blessings of fortune. A living room complete with stone fireplace waited, cured logs piled neatly within. Precious fuel for warmth. Beckett's supplies also contained lighting fluid, left from a raid on a barbecue display at a Walmart that had been nearly picked clean. Within minutes a cozy blaze crackled, banishing chill from aged walls. Beckett sighed content, fatigue ebbing as he emptied cans of chopped vegetables and meat into a small pot for stew. Tonight comforts matched any he'd known before. This promising start rekindled Beckett's optimism for exploring ahead. Perhaps within Detroit's remains lay not struggles, but opportunities to strengthen his survival skills further. The pre-dawn light highlighted omens along Michigan Avenue as Beckett rolled cautiously deeper into city blocks. Gang identifiers covered every surface in hues that had lost meaning, yet lingered as territorial warnings. Graffiti decorated the streets of the hallway to an urban museum. Beckett gripped his Mossberg tightly, acutely aware a bow alone now felt inadequate against threats lurking amid ancient graffiti. But the need for a better source of protection drove him to seek what he needed within, a sidearm for close-quarters defense. As Beckett scouted southwest Detroit, clues emerged pointing him towards an unnerving yet potentially fruitful destination. Pitchfork tags and block letters formed a trail towards the former headquarters of the Gangsta Disciples gang. Litter strewn outside, broken bottles, discarded paraphernalia, affirmed he'd found the abandoned trap house. Beckett was no stranger to such ravaged places from his time roaming the city before, but entering one alone gave even his seasoned nerves cause to jitter. Beckett nudged the sagging front door and slid into the shadows within. Dust danced in dusty sunrays, undisturbed save cobwebs and time. Scrawled tags remained in haunting accusations, but the house itself lay silent. Beckett breathed deep to steady his quickened heart, then began advanced methodically through each room. One never knew what lingering ghosts or more corporeal dangers might inhabit such a scar of the old world. As he ventured deeper into the decrepit structure he heard the crack of thunder in the sudden onset of pouring rain. The storm raged outside as Beckett rummaged through the remains of the old trap house. As lightning flashed, he saw the decaying walls were stained with years of filth. This place had been untouched since the collapse, a time capsule of the old world of gangs. Beckett kept his Mossberg at the ready as he continued searching room to room. Most were stripped bare, but a lingering scent told of chemicals once cooked up. As the boy explored, the sound of thunder masked his steps on the creaking floorboards. In the last room, Beckett spotted a glint under a pile of trash. He swept it aside to find a pistol, still in remarkably good condition. Checking the magazine, he saw it was fully loaded. This was lucky beyond words in the dead world. Securing his new prize, Beckett did one last sweep. A panel in the wall caught his eye, and he pried it open to reveal a well-stocked pantry. Canned goods and propane canisters enough to keep him alive for weeks. Fortune had finally smiled upon him. The storm showed no signs of letting up, so Beckett decided to wait it out in the relative shelter of the trap house. As night fell, the fire from his makeshift stove warded off the darkness. 5. Beckett awoke to the pitter-patter of rain on the trap house's decaying roof. The storm still raged outside, and a dull gray light filtered in through cracks in the walls. As he warmed up the propane-fueled stove, Beckett felt a hollow ache in his chest. The events of the past year came flooding back, watching his parents succumb to the virus, wandering the empty streets alone for months on end. At only 13 years old, he was the sole survivor in a nightmare existence. Eating his meager breakfast in silence, Beckett was overwhelmed by loneliness. The traces of the gangs who once inhabited this place only emphasized how isolated he truly was. As he'd done every morning since the outbreak, Beckett scanned the sky, hoping against hope to see signs of life, a rescue helicopter, plume of smoke from a distant campfire. But there was nothing, only gray clouds as far as the eye could see. He longed for human contact, to know that he wasn't truly the last person left in the world. But out here in the dead zone, that hope grew thinner every day. Beckett wondered if his fate was to wander forever in this purgatory, the sole witness to humanity's fall. As the rain beat down mercilessly, he withdrew into himself, battling the demons of isolation with only his thoughts for company. As the storm began to clear in the afternoon, rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Beckett saw his chance to continue his search. After packing up his meager supplies, he wheeled his bicycle out from under the pavilion's protective awning. The roads were treacherous, flooded in places and slick with mud. But Beckett pedaled on resolutely, keeping his eyes fixed on the skyline in the distance. Detroit loomed ahead, a reminder of what the world had once been. He hoped amongst the abandoned skyscrapers and empty streets, he might find some sign that humanity's flame still flickered, however faint. It was slow going along the highway, weaving between abandoned cars that cluttered the asphalt. But Beckett was young and determined, pushing himself until the city limits came into view. Entering downtown, he was struck by the eerie silence. Once raucous business districts stood derelict, windows broken, papers and debris scattered by the wind. As dusk fell, Beckett searched for a secure place to hunker down for the night. He scouted empty office towers, catching glimpses of dusty offices still containing skeletons of computers and filing cabinets. Finally, Beckett found refuge on a high floor, barricading the entrance as much as possible. A fire brought meager comfort as he rested, reflecting on his journey so far. Beckett awoke restless after another fitful night. He had grown accustomed to a life of caution and silence, always vigilant for any threat. But here, high above the empty streets, a new feeling emerged, one of childlike wonder and excitement. What treasures might this towering structure hold after all these years untouched? Fueled by curiosity, Beckett decided to spend a day exploring, not as a scavenger but as an adventurer discovering hidden places. He doubted any wild animals could reach such heights, allowing himself to let go of fear, if only for a while. Beckett rummaged through deserted offices, finding relics of the past that piqued his interest, business cards with outdated job titles, framed photos of smiling executives long gone, curios and knickknacks untouched by time. He even discovered an untouched break room, helping himself to dusty packets of past expired food just for the novelty. Outdated computers and phones provided hours of puzzle-solving fun as Beckett tried to turn them on, guessing old passwords. Rolling chairs and emptied file cabinets became pretend vehicles and obstacles in made-up games of imagination through the maze-like hallways and atriums. For a day, Beckett felt like any ordinary kid, unburdened by the horrors he had endured. He smiled and laughed perhaps more than he had in years. By dusk, Beckett laid back exhausted but content, having lost himself in childish adventures amongst relics of a world gone by. He felt lighter in spirit, with hope that amidst destruction, moments of joy could still be found. Unable to sleep, Beckett's mind was abuzz from his exciting day of exploration. He quietly made his way to the stairwell and climbed the many flights of stairs until emerging onto the roof. Gingerly crawling out to the very edge, Beckett gazed down in awe at the city laid out below. From his lofty perch high atop the skyscraper, the remains of humanity's metropolis stretched as far as the eye could see. Other hollowed-out towers stood like silent monoliths all around. Yet gazing upward, Beckett was struck by the dominion of the night sky. Without the usual glow of city lights, the velvety darkness above was flooded with more stars than he could ever have imagined. They glittered in thick, dreamlike swathes across the inky canvas of space. The familiar constellations he knew from books were lost amongst the profusion of celestial bodies littering the skies. Beckett found himself laid out for hours on the rough cement, exploring the cosmic vistas above with wide-eyed awe and curiosity. In that moment, gazing at the eternal dance of the stars, Beckett felt very small indeed. But also strangely comforted. As long as the heavens preserved their ancient patterns, perhaps there was hope that someday, under kinder skies, mankind might gaze up at the stars once more and remember who they were. 6. Beckett awoke with a start as the echo of metal on metal rang out through the silent city. Rolling to the edge of the roof, he peered over to see the smoldering wreckage of a car below. A disheveled man stumbled out of the driver's seat, waving a bottle and slurring a string of curses to no one. Beckett watched with cautious curiosity. As the man kicked at the crumpled light pole, Beckett noticed something glittering in the waistband of his jeans. His eyes widened as he realized, a pistol. This man was clearly dangerous, in his inebriated state. Beckett scrambled back from the edge as the shouting grew more uncontrolled. What should he do? Reveal himself and hope this stranger meant no harm? Or keep hidden, and risk an unpredictable encounter if discovered? His rapid heartbeat echoed the crashes from below as uncertainty set in. Night was fading fast. Soon the man would notice the empty streets around and realize he was not alone. Beckett knew he must decide on a course of action before the coming of light revealed his position. Beckett held his breath as he peered over the edge of the roof, down at the street below. The man was stumbling around the crashed car, the horn still blared obnoxiously echoing off the empty streets. Beckett's bike caught the man's eye, parked out front where he had left it. "What's this?" the man slurred, lurching over to it. Beckett went cold as the man grabbed the handlebars, giving the bike a shake. "Hey! Come out, the man started shouting. Beckett shrank back, pressing himself flat against the gritty roof surface. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the man below could hear it. But he didn't dare make a sound. The man launched into a string of threats and curses, promising all manner of violence if Beckett didn't show himself. Beckett screwed his eyes shut, as if that could somehow block out the awful yelling. Beckett lay frozen in fear atop the roof, hardly daring to breathe as the drunken shouts echoed from the street below. The man's violent threats cut through the evening air, a chilling promise of danger in this new lawless world. As long as Beckett didn't move a muscle, maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be spotted. Night was falling but the man showed no signs of leaving. Beckett knew he couldn't stay stuck on the open roof forever. When a round of gunshots rang out downtown, drowning out the shouts for a moment, he seized his chance. Ever so slowly, Beckett inched his way toward the roof's edge on his belly. Peering over, he scanned for the safest route down. The fire escape was his only option, clinging to the back of the building, out of the man's view, if he could just reach it quietly. Sliding over the low wall, Beckett lowered himself with a grimace, feet searching frantically for the ladder. Below, shattering glass spurred him into motion with a surge of adrenaline. His foot found purchase and he raced down the trembling metal steps 2 at a time, praying they didn't betray his position. As Beckett descended into the darkening alleyway, the shouts grew louder, closer. He could hear crashing and cursing from inside the lower floors now. Pressing himself into the shadows, Beckett stifled his breath and waited, every nerve on fire, for the man to pass by on his hunt. Beckett peered over the edge of the crumbling fire escape and cursed his luck. The last flight had completely broken away, leaving a 50-foot gap to the dirty alley below. He could hear his pursuer's boots now crunching through the debris inside, coming closer to the ground floor exit. There was no time. Gripping his Mossberg tightly, Beckett took aim at the darkened window above him. One solid hit left a web of cracks across the glass. A second blow shattered it entirely. He flung himself through without hesitation, feeling shards cut into his arms as he rolled to a stop on the grimy interior floor. "There you are!" The shout echoed up from only 4 levels below, chillingly close. Beckett scrambled to his feet, frantically scanning the gloomy hallway for cover. A half-open doorway caught his eye, it would have to do. He flung himself into the room just as pounding footsteps approached the bottom of the stairs. Pressing up against the wall, Beckett held his breath and listened, tensed for the creak of each step and furious curses as the man ascended. The 5th floor of the derelict high-rise was a haunting still life of the world before the end. Stale air hung heavy with the scent of decay and old memories, while dust particles danced in the shafts of moonlight that penetrated the shattered windows. And there, hidden behind a scarred wooden door, stood Beckett, clutching his Mossberg with knuckles white from the death grip. He could hear the man's ragged breaths, punctuated by slurred, menacing words that echoed up the stairwell. Each syllable sent a fresh wave of terror pulsating through his veins, chilling his blood. His heart pounded a relentless rhythm in his chest, a wild drum threatening to betray his position. "I've had my fill of so-called civility," the man bellowed upwards, his voice a grotesque parody of joviality. "Now, the world's my oyster, and I'm the pearl. Before the fall of man I was the fall of man. I skin plenty of cunts and dickheads. I'm going to do the same to you tonight, a man has to eat." His words were a twisted sonnet sung to the apocalypse, a revelation into the freedom found in chaos, and they made Beckett's stomach churn. Beckett's breath hitched in his throat as he heard the man finally reach the top of the stairs. He swallowed hard, trying to silence the fear that threatened to spill from his lips. His mind raced with the possible scenarios. Would the man pass by without a second thought, or would he pause, his drunken senses catching the faintest hint of another's presence? The hallway creaked in protest as the man started his dreadful procession past the row of doors. Beckett tightened his grip on his Mossberg, his finger hovering over the trigger. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, stinging his eyes. He could feel the ghost of a tremble begin in his hands, but he fought it back with a silent prayer to whatever gods might still be listening. The man's voice was closer now, his words a low rumble that vibrated through the thin wooden door. He chuckled, a sickening sound that sent a shiver down Beckett's neck. The floorboards outside groaned under the man's weight, a haunting lullaby that filled the silence between his declarations of anarchy. Beckett held his breath as he heard the man stop outside his door. His heart pounded against his ribcage like a caged beast, each beat a deafening roar in his ears. He could feel the man's presence on the other side of the door, feel his drunken mirth and terrifying freedom. Could even smell the alcohol on his breath. Beckett hid quietly, breathing slowly through his mouth to stay silent. The events of the last hour played on loop in his mind. Now he was trapped, alone in the dark, listening to each heavy footfall that passed outside. He felt the weight of his Mossberg pump action heavy in his hands, hoping against hope he wouldn't need to use it. Taking a life was never something he could do lightly, even in self-defense. The footsteps slowed as they traveled farther past his hiding place. Beckett let out the breath he'd been holding in a silent whoosh of relief. But it was too soon. Before he could draw another calming lungful, a crash of splintering wood echoed through the small space. Wood splintered as the door to the adjacent office was shattered inward off its hinges. Beckett blinked against the sound, just making out a dark silhouette framed in the doorway, backlit against the fading moonlight outside. A long, hooded cloak obscured any distinguishing features. All Beckett knew for certain was the glint of gunmetal in the figure's raised hand, pointing directly at him. Instinct took over as the dark figure raised its weapon. Beckett threw himself sideways, tucking into a roll as three deafening cracks split the air. Splinters and dust rained down from the fresh bullet holes pockmarking the small dry wall barrier that separates the two offices. In his haste to flee, Beckett's grip slipped on his Mossberg. The shotgun clattered loudly to the floor behind him as he scrambled out the shattered door frame. Panic and adrenaline pushed him to his feet in a blind sprint. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead under the flickering emergency lights. His pursuer's boots thundered in pursuit, gaining quickly. At the first corner, Beckett's foot caught on a loose tile. Momentum sent him sprawling hard across the grimy floor. He chipped a tooth on impact but sprung back to his feet and continued his momentum. Pain shot through his palms where they struck, but he had no time to acknowledge it. Shouts and gunfire echoed too closely behind. Beckett pushed himself up and staggered onward at a limping run. The stairwell sign grew nearer with each pleading step. Bursting through the door, Beckett took the stairs two at a time, gravity and fear aiding his reckless speed. His straining muscles and heavy breath were nothing against the terror nipping at his heels. Each landing flashed by in a dizzying blur as he plunged deeper into the depths, chased by the maniacal cries of his pursuer giving chase. Beckett stumbled out of the emergency stairwell, lungs burning. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath as he took in his surroundings. Rows of darkened offices lined either side of a long corridor. With no windows to expose his location, he took a chance. Pressing himself flat, Beckett squeezed between two towering file cabinets. His thin frame folded barely into the narrow gap, leaving only a sliver of space to peer through. Footsteps echoed from above as his pursuer descended. Through the crack in his hiding place, Beckett watched a pair of worn boots hit the floor and stride down the hallway. The steady gait held no hurry, his hunter was toying with him now, savoring the chase. "I know you're out there," a rasping voice called. It sent an electrifying chill through Beckett's veins. "No use hiding. It's just you and me now." A humorless chuckle drifted down the hallway. "You remind me of the others. All that pathetic scrabbling to survive. But some games never ended, even after everything fell." Beckett stifled a horrified gasp. The implications were unmistakable. This man was no ordinary predator, he had hunted people for sport long before the world went mad. Trapped alone with a serial killer in the darkened building, Beckett realized with grim finality that this may be his end. But as long as there was breath in his body, he vowed not to go down without a fight. As the serial killer strode down the hallway, his cruel taunts bounced off the walls. "I know you're still here, rat. Might as well come out, it'll be quicker that way." Beckett held his breath, pressing deeper into his hiding place. Through the gap, he saw his tormentor stop to reload. But his thumb slipped, spilling bullets across the floor. "Damn it!" In a rage, the killer emptied his remaining rounds wildly into the nearest office. The echoing cracks were deafening in the confined space. When the chamber clicked empty, he growled and flung the useless gun aside. It was then that Beckett saw what caused his heart to nearly stop. From inside his worn coat, the man withdrew a long, serrated knife that caught the emergency lights with a malevolent glint. In response, Beckett cautiously felt around his waist, gripping the cold steel of the crude handgun he'd scavenged earlier. It was his final option if those hateful eyes should find him cowering helpless in this maze of cabinets and shadowy offices. He said a silent prayer, knowing their vicious dance of cat and mouse was hurtling towards its deadliest climax. As the serial killer's smile stretched wider, slower, Beckett knew with gut-wrenching clarity he was out of options. In one desperation move, he thrust himself from the hiding place, shakily leveling the pistol. "Stop right there," he shouted, though it came out more scared squeak than commanding order. But to his horror, the killer only threw his head back and laughed. "Is that supposed to scare me, boy?" He took a leisurely step forward, toying with his prey. Beckett's finger trembled on the trigger. He took a shuddering breath to steady his aim at the killer's chest. All his hope rested on this one shot. He squeezed. And heard a horrifying click. The gun had misfired. A frozen moment passed before his attacker smiled a smile too wide, too many teeth glinting in the half-light. "You had your chance," the killer crooned, shotgun laughter bubbling underneath. Beckett released the empty pistol in shock. His heart slammed so hard against his ribs he thought they might break. After coming this far, it was all to end here in this gloomy hallway, alone with a monster. He could only squeeze his eyes shut and wait for the fatal blow. The skies opened with a roar as lightning cracked directly overhead. For a split second, the enclosed hallway was illuminated in a flash of ghostly blue light. In that moment, with the killer's attention briefly diverted, Beckett sprang into action. He rolled away, scrambling blindly through the shadows as the thunder's boom shook the building. His pursuer whirled at the movement, letting out an inhuman howl of frustration. Through the chaos of wind and rain pounding the windows, Beckett glimpsed the killer surveying the flickering darkness for any sign of movement. Taking the opportunity, Beckett pushed himself to his feet and bolted down the hallway. Adrenaline masked the ache in his weary limbs as he dashed from office to office, ducking behind rows of desks and cabinets. Waiting for gunshots to ring out, but the sound never came. Though the storm masked his footfalls, Beckett knew it was only a matter of time before he was found again. He had to keep moving, keep confusing the trail. Staying frozen in fright was no longer an option. Fight or flight had awakened a primal need to survive inside him. From behind, he heard a crash as the enraged killer began toppling furniture in their blind tantrum. Beckett dared not look back, plunging deeper into the maze as the storm raged outside. The game of cat and mouse continued anew in the turbulent dark. Through the howling wind and rain, another cracking boom of thunder signaled Beckett's chance. As blinding light flickered through the building, he plunged towards a bank of windows at the end of the hallway. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Beckett slammed his shoulder into the fire exit bar. With a groan, the rusted metal door swung open and he tumbled through. Icy rain instantly soaked through his clothes as Beckett found himself in a narrow alleyway. Wasting no time, he ghosted the door shut behind him, fighting every urge to slam it in his desperation. Gripping the damp brick walls for balance, Beckett fled down the deserted backstreet as the storm intensified. At the fork ahead, instinct took over. He veered right, spotting a side entrance beneath a faded neon sign up ahead. With numb fingers, Beckett clutched the rusted handle and turned. To his relief, it slowly crept open with only a low squeal. He slipped inside, pulling it shut behind with a trembling sigh of relief. For now, he was hidden. But how long until the hunter's rage drove him to search these back alley passages? Beckett knew he couldn't stop running until the killer's bloodthirst was quenched, or he was dead in its place. As Beckett caught his breath in the unfamiliar building, his young mind swirled with tactics both clever and risky. He knew he couldn't face the killer head-on, but remaining stationary meant only being tracked down again. And frankly, he was sick of running. His blood was still boiling from the bear chasing him out of his shelter. A distraction might buy him valuable time to disappear into the stormy night. Beckett crouched low, his heart racing. The dusty, echoing silence was occasionally broken by the distant howl of the wind. As Beckett moved cautiously through the dilapidated structure, he couldn't help but remember the classic film, Home Alone. He was just a 13-year-old boy, after all, and the idea of setting up traps to outsmart his pursuer felt strangely familiar, though the stakes were much higher. His young mind raced as he scoured the building for supplies. Broken glass, old nails, and pieces of rusty metal were scattered about, and Beckett realized he had to make use of whatever he could find. He gathered a few sharp shards of glass, a length of frayed wire, and some loose floorboards. With a determined glint in his eyes, he began setting his makeshift traps. He strategically placed the glass shards near doorways and windows, ensuring that any unwanted intruder would meet a painful surprise. He tied the wire to a doorknob, creating a tripwire that would trigger a cascade of debris. As he worked quietly, the silence of the abandoned building was only broken by the occasional creaking of the structure. Beckett knew he had to be swift and clever to outwit the killer who was closing in on him. His angry grunts of frustration carried on the storm-driven wind. 7. The pelting rain created an ominous staccato against the crumbling walls of the abandoned Detroit warehouse. Each drop sent a chill down Beckett's spine as he waited in the darkness. His eyes slowly adjusting, becoming attuned to the dark around him. His heart drummed a frenetic rhythm to match the storm, every thundering beat like a countdown to his impending fate. How long had it been since he lost the killer in these decaying streets? Minutes? Hours? Time had no meaning anymore in this nightmare. All he knew was that his pursuer was closing in, stalking him relentlessly through the dripping alleyways. He had to make his final stand, and this warehouse offered the only shelter within reach. But would its walls protect him, or become his tomb? Beckett had lingered in the shadows, watching through shattered windows, setting crude traps along the structural weaknesses of the building. It was a poor defense against a brutal and seasoned murderer, but what other choice did he have? At least here, in the darkness, he had the advantage of surprise. A shriek of rusted metal tore through the storm outside. Beckett's breath caught in his throat as he faded back into the inky blackness of the room. The footsteps drew nearer, each one hammering in his ears like the pounding of execution drums. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, as if allowing every moment to drag out Beckett's terror. At first only darkness was visible, the howling storm the only sound piercing the inky black beyond. Then a booted foot emerged, gingerly testing the floorboards. As weight was placed upon it, the loosened plank gave way with a sickening crack. A sharp steel bite shredded through leather to draw blood. Beckett's first trap had been sprung. The furious murderer dug the teeth of the trap out of his ankle, discarding his leather boot. Yet still the figure advanced, driven by unchecked murderous intent. A heavy stride triggered the tripwire, but the assailant threw up an arm just in time to deflect the slicing saw blades. Not fast enough to stop one from biting deep into flesh. A pain-filled grunt was barely audible over the storm. Undaunted, the looming shape hobbled further into the warehouse on 3 limbs. His injured leg dragged uselessly, leaving a gruesome smear upon the floor. Then that leg fell through a weakened patch, becoming instantly tangled in the steel twine Beckett had strategically placed below. The more the man struggled, the higher than the noose got on his limb. A trap had finally stopped his stalker's advance, if only momentarily. With the hunter disabled, at least for now, Beckett seized his chance. He vaulted from his hiding spot with a pipe raised high, sprinting towards the glimmer of escape visible beyond. Adrenaline surged through Beckett as he ran past his bleeding, struggling pursuer. He dodged past each crude trap he had laid, memory guiding his feet unerringly through the minefield of danger. Bursting out into the howling storm, Beckett spotted his battered bike waiting just as he left it. Next to it sat a shopping cart piled high with all his worldly possessions. He had no time to gather them now. Vaulting onto the bike, Beckett kicked off hard and began to furiously pedal into the night. Fat raindrops stung his eyes as he raced down the flooded alleyways, the squeal of his bike's rusted chains merging with the cries of the gale around him. Through the roar of the elements he feared further sounds of pursuit, but dared not look back to check. All his energy focused on pumping his legs faster, faster, fleeing for his very life. Lungs screamed and muscles burned from overexertion, but still he drove himself onward through the engulfing darkness. Deep in the ruins of Detroit, Beckett had no idea where his frantic flight might lead. All that mattered now was distance, putting as much space between him and that warehouse, between him and his murderous stalker, as humanly possible. Exhausted yet desperate, Beckett pedaled on into the maelstrom, the shadow of death snapping at his heels with every turning wheel. The rain-slicked street offered no warning as Beckett's front tire caught the uneven lip of a broken curb. In an instant he was flying, bike tumbling end over end as he crashed hard onto the wet asphalt. Skidding and skipping across the rough surface, all Beckett could do was curl into a ball and throw his arms over his head. He felt the skin rip away from his elbows and knees as the merciless ground did its damage. Momentum finally spent, he rolled and turned, vision swirling from the impact. Pushing dazedly to his feet, Beckett spat blood and spun to check his backtrail. Through the veil of precipitation, no dark shape yet materialized in pursuit. But he knew it was only a matter of moments, maybe seconds before the relentless killer would be upon him once more. Heart in his throat, Beckett scanned the murky alley for any means of further flight. His eyes fell upon an abandoned delivery van, passenger door hanging open in welcome. Without a second thought, he launched himself inside and frantically felt around for the keys. Fingers closed around the blessed yield of metal just as a blood-curdling howl rose over the wind. His pursuer had found the trail again. Jamming keys into the ignition, Beckett cranked with all his flagging might. Please survive, he begged the weary engine. After an eternity it churned to rattling life, just in time to see the killer emerge from the tempest, leveling Beckett's shotgun with unflinching intent. Heart crashing against ribs, Beckett floored the accelerator straight at the hooded threat, adrenaline overriding survival instinct. At the last second, he cranked the wheel hard as fingers squeezed the trigger. The boom was deafening, pellets punching into the van's radiator in a lethal spray. Steam billowed as more shells tore through metal, one just missing Beckett through the spider-webbed windshield. Still he barreled forward blindly through the dense fog, chassis grinding from the damage. Risking a glance behind, he saw only unfettered pursuit. The killer seemed undeterred despite a limp now hobbling their step. Beckett swerved the van desperately, trying to clear the spiderweb of cracks in the windshield caused by the gunshot. But it was no use, he could barely see 2 feet in front of him. He slammed on the brakes but it was too late. Up ahead a large oak tree loomed through the blurred glass. With a loud crack, the van collided with the tree. Beckett felt all the air leave his lungs as his body was thrown forward against the steering wheel. Pain exploded in his head and everything went black for a moment. When he came to, the van was ominously still and quiet except for the hissing of steam from the crumpled hood. Beckett touched his forehead and his fingers came away sticky with blood. Groaning, he undid his seatbelt with shaking hands and pushed open the driver's side door, falling to the ground. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision once more. Beckett fought to stay conscious, knowing he had to get away from the crash site. But which way was away? He dragged himself through the leaves, leaving a bloody trail behind. Eventually the darkness overtook him and he collapsed, completely spent. Beckett began to stir, sensing a light pattering around him. As his eyes flickered open, the first thing he saw was a mixture of blood and water spreading across the wet leaves. It was raining still, and Beckett ached everywhere. He touched his fingers to his lips and they came away crimson. His entire body ached as he slowly pulled himself up into a sitting position. A cold wind blew through the trees, piercing his soaked clothes that clung heavily to his skin. Then he heard it, the unmistakable voice of the killer echoing in the darkness of the woods. Horrible profanities and threats being screamed into the night. But Beckett didn't have the energy to react to the taunts. He knew he needed to focus on a plan. As quietly as possible, Beckett pushed himself to his feet. He leaned against a thick tree trunk for support, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass. When his vision cleared, he peered out into the rainy gloom. Some distance away he spotted a flickering light and shape moving among the trees, the killer, still searching. An idea came to Beckett then. If he could stealthily circle around through the foliage, staying downwind, perhaps the killer's focus on noise would allow Beckett to slip by undetected. It was a long shot but his only chance. Silently praying the rain would mask his movements, Beckett began his maneuver through the shadowy forest. He stuck to areas with the densest cover, scarcely daring to breathe. As Beckett emerged from the woods onto the empty road, rain continued pouring down in a dense sheet. He looked around frantically for anything that could help turn the tables on his pursuer. Then, through the gloom, he spotted the remains of a structure just off the road. It was an old storage building, burned out and falling apart from years of abandonment. Beckett knew some people had resorted to setting fire to infected areas in the early days of the outbreak. This structure had clearly met such a fate. As he ran towards it, Beckett said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, hoping his gambit would pay off. Around the back sat a small tool shed, miraculously still standing. He threw open the creaking door. By some stroke of luck, hanging on the wall was a large, rugged machete. Beckett pulled it down and weighed the weapon in his hands, the worn wooden grip feeling right at home in his grasp. It was time to turn hunter into hunted. Racing back to the house through the deluge, Beckett selected the most unstable-looking interior support beam. He began hacking away furiously with the blade. The thwacks carried loudly through the night. It wasn't long before the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps caught up to Beckett in the dark. His trap was set, and the killer had taken the bait. As the killer stalked into the ruined building, he found no immediate sign of Beckett. A twisted smile grew on his face, he liked it when his prey made things interesting. The man began kicking over charred debris, tearing aside tattered rags that may have once been furniture. Come out, wherever you are," he sang in a mocking tone. Beckett remained perfectly still in the shadows of a corner. He watched as his enemy circled the room like a hungry predator. When the killer's back was turned, Beckett tightened his grip on the machete's handle. Then the moment arrived. The killer strode right in front of the structural beam Beckett had weakened. Without a second thought, Beckett burst from his hiding place with an enraged yell. All of his fear and exhaustion transformed into brutish strength. He barreled straight into the killer, using every last ounce of momentum to slam the man against the half-rotted wood.